is Awkward, and these are the Awkward interviews. My guest today is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national abolitionist organization, a group of people that I admire greatly. He's a founding member of the Critical Ethnic Studies Association and is part of the Abolition Collective and Scholars for Social Justice. Recently, he also founded Abolition, a journal of insurgent politics. He wrote The Magical Thinking of Reformism for Colin Kaepernick's Abolition for the People series, and has also written for Black Agenda Report, Harvard Law Review, American Quarterly, Radical History Review, Color Lines, The Abolitionist, and more. I'm not the only media member who appreciates his expertise, as he's also been featured on Huffington Post Live, The Real News Network, and radio stations where I am in New York City, in Montreal, and throughout California, where he resides and serves as Media and Cultural Studies professor at UC Riverside. This guy was named to the inaugural class of Freedom Scholars in 2020 and is also president of the American Studies Association, but that's not all. He's the author of 3 books, White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare, and the Logic of Racial Genocide, Forced Passages, Imprisoned Radical Intellectuals in the US Prison Regime, and Suspended Apocalypse, White Supremacy, Genocide, and the Filipino Condition, and was also co-editor of the field-shaping anthology, Critical Ethnic Studies, A Reader. My guest today is Dr. Dylan Rodriguez. It is an absolute honor to have you. Thank you so much for joining me, man.
I'm so thrilled to be here, and that's the last time you call me doctor.
Yeah, you got it. Dylan,
you can call me fake doctor. Call me fake Dr. Rodriguez. I'm good, because that's more how they treat me anyways.
Right. I mean, that is how those in your world get treated. But to me, putting in that work deserves recognition.
Appreciate it, man. I appreciate it.
No doubt. So let's just start off as generally as we possibly can for anyone who may be new to this, and also so that they can get to know you. What is abolition, and what was your path to the realization that reforms don't work and there are better ways to construct our society and ensure public safety?
Abolition is a long archive of collective creativity and world making that is based on liberation from oppressive violence, and really from the long logic of anti-Black chattel slavery. So it is grounded in a Black revolutionary and Black radical tradition that I think is indispensable and permanent. I think it is important for me to emphasize that, because over about the last year to year and a half, there's been increasing traction around the term, rhetoric, politics, et cetera, of abolition. And I'm not sure that folks that have been attracted to it have adequately engaged with the forms of collective study that are central to abolitionist praxis and organizing, everything, right? It's not a trademark, you know what I'm saying? It's not an identity. And it's also not an outcome, right? It's a kind of ongoing commitment to praxis. It's an ongoing commitment to collective creativity. And it's also something that requires a kind of engagement, a direct, ongoing, critical, collective engagement with the Black radical and Black revolutionary tradition, like in a direct way, right? So there's no doing abolition without that work. So on the one hand, there's that piece of it, which is to say it's about complete world destruction and transformation at once. It's creative, it is collective, it is loving, it is about being, right? It's about the liberation of being against the oppressive imposition of a particular way of being that this modernity, this civilization has forced on people. My path is one that did not entail any particular moment of revelation. Right. So I know that a lot of times there's a political narrative or a kind of biographical narrative we create for ourselves. We're like, there's a particular moment where everything became clear, and that was that. I'm first person in my family born in the United States. My parents were the first in their families to migrate to the United States in the late 60s, early 70s. I grew up in Northern Virginia, Alexandria, old slave port. It was pretty clear from the time I understood what was going on around me that there were choices to be made about where one existed or who one existed with in the world. All right. I was around deep anti-Blackness and liberal white supremacy, as well as right-wing white supremacy, pretty much my entire life. From the schools I went to the sports I played and the people I was around, whatnot. And so the sides became gradually clear as I became of age. And then it was being in the collective work of creating this organization, Critical Resistance, that I was around old head veterans. And I'm talking attorneys, activists, scholars, formerly incarcerated people, former political prisoners, former prisoners of war, some current political prisoners of war who I was corresponding with and who I made contact with in other ways. The reason that community was so important is, number one, it was humbling, right? I was always used to priding myself on being the most insightful, critical, analytical, whatever, smartest person in the room. And this was one situation in which I understood I was a student, right? I was an apprentice. So while it sounds great for me to, put in my bio, I'm a founding member of the Critical Resistance Organizing Collective, I was very much just a founding gopher, right? Let me be totally transparent. I mean, I didn't do a lot to kind of shape the conceptualization of that organization until years later. I was trying to make myself useful. This is part of abolitionist praxis too, y'all. Like, a lot of people that are in positions where they have a bunch of letters by their name, they enter collectives and they feel right away as if they have to be that person again, right? And this was an important political lesson. And like, you can probably tell, that's not me. I'm hardwired to be out there, to be doing stuff all the time. This is one where I had to shut the fuck up, because I didn't understand just how deep the violence was that people had experienced, in which they were now engaging with, and were inviting me to participate in building a project to completely overturn. So I was a student for, I'd say, 3, 4, 5 years. It was like getting another degree in a sense, right? It was a grassroots degree. And it was in that collective, in that community of people, that two things happened that directly respond to your question. One is mostly formerly incarcerated people directly talked about what we were at that point naming the prison industrial complex, which I think we should still use, right? I actually don't like the term mass incarceration for a bunch of different reasons. But folks in that community, in that collective, we're talking about the prison industrial complex as inflicting genocide, or at least a logic of genocide, on their people, on their communities, on the places they were from, right? Dorsey Nunn, who's well known in the Bay Area, been working with legal services for prisoners with children. All of us are one of the founders of All of Us Are None, et cetera. He might have been the first person I heard kind of in a room name it that way. He said, I'm from East Palo Alto. I'm incarcerated by the drug war, and I'm here because the prison industrial complex is waging a war of genocide on the Black people in my community, right? It's waging a war of genocide on Black East Palo Alto, etc. So it's like, that was a holy shit moment, right? So it wasn't quite revelatory, but it was clarifying. It was analytically and rhetorically, for that matter, clarifying. It's like, okay, that makes sense to me. Rita Bo Brown, who is near the end of life right now, right? So I want to honor Rita Bo Brown, former political prisoner, member of the George Jackson Brigade, a proud Butch Dyke lesbian who, back in the day, when she was engaged in guerrilla war against the oppressive U.S. state, had a full goatee. So when they were hunting her down, they were looking for a dude. They're looking for a white man, and blah, blah, blah. So Rita Bo Brown's badass. Bo Brown said the same shit, right? Bo Brown said, I'm engaged in this because I'm in solidarity with my Black comrades, and that's what the brigade was about up in the Northwest. That clarified it. Okay, so there was that arm of things that clarified that this shit is genocide, and when you have a genocidal apparatus, what is the only position you take is one of stopping it. Right? The other term would be abolition, right? You don't do shit with it other than stop it. You want to destroy the system that is committing genocide against a particular population, or at least engage, even shows the potential for genocide, right? You stop that shit. You don't wait for it to unfold, much less do you sit in it while it's unfolding around you. So that's number one. Number two is, this is just as meaningful, I was also surrounded by old head veteran activists, scholars, attorneys, et cetera, that were there, that did not necessarily call themselves abolitionists, but had convened because they were bonded by the fact that decades of participation in militant reformist struggle against the criminal justice system, policing, et cetera, had not only not worked to alleviate the violence, the state violence against targeted people, against Black people, you know, unhoused people, et cetera. Not only did it not alleviate that, it had actually made things worse. It had actually unwittingly contributed to growing the system that turned into the prison industrial complex. So these were people that were taking a sense of political responsibility for the fact that everything that they had been doing pretty much for their almost their whole adult lives had not only been inadequate, but had become absorbed into the very system that they had devoted themselves to fighting. So it was that collective shared sensibility. It wasn't just an analysis, it was a sensibility that made me in a very principled way reject reformism, right? Not reform necessarily, but reformism. Reformism as the ideology that says that reform is the horizon of social change. That's all you can do. You work within the system, you tweak the system, and that's it. These were folks that were telling me so clearly through a variety of compiled, archival, direct experience, as well as like deep analysis, that reformism is the problem. It is central to the problem. And now we got to get into a whole collective discussion about what do we do, right? What do we do? And I'd say it was a couple years in, the first massive movement building conference that Critical Resistance held was in 1998 at UC campus of UC Berkeley. 3,000, maybe probably close to 4,000 people took that shit over. Most people were, I think in my memory, most people were unregistered. Geronimo G. Jaga showed up and surprised everybody. He had just gotten out. One of the most like formative moments of my fucking life was seeing Geronimo G. Jaga walk down the aisle and like tell us to love each other. It was deep. Peace to Geronimo G. Jaga, man. And I was a gopher the whole time. I had a little earpiece in. I was just trying to stop sectarian fights between different organizations because I look like this, so people think I can be a bouncer or something. So I was like getting in between organizations. I was helping seat people at events, and I was a gopher, and I was proud, man. I was proud to be the gopher. I'm not saying that with a false sense of humility. I was like, I'm happy to be part of this thing. And then I kind of grew into that, and I realized my whole intellectual, scholarly, and pedagogical life was going to be devoted to doing this work in all kind of different ways. So that's my long path, man. I'm sorry for the long soliloquy, but you asked a hard question.
That was, that was an amazing answer. You know, I mean, I don't just say that. Like, there are so many different parts of that, like that were meaningful. And I mean, first I'll just say that it sounds like an incredible opportunity. Like, and I appreciate you giving me an opportunity myself to like almost feel like I was in the room for a moment, and I mean, you mentioned a bunch of other things I do want to touch on. Like, one, I think is really critical to the work you do, the concept of being, and, as it relates to white reconstruction and everything like that. And I think we'll go back to that. I do want to point out before I discuss reforms and reformism, that you mentioned more than once creativity and love. And there is absolutely a misconception in the general populace, perpetuated by the media and politicians, that abolition is, lawlessness, and that, I mean, when they hear you talk, they're gonna have a hard time reconciling what they're telling people. And you're
that's
not
the same shit. Hey, that's the same shit they said about enslaved people uprising.
Mm-hmm.
All right, it's like the same fucking description. That's why some of these people, I wonder if they've ever picked up any historical text at all and seen themselves in the words of fucking slave owners in the slave society. I'm not just talking about white people. I'm talking about a lot of people that look like me and are darker than me that are saying the same shit. So anyway, I sorry to interrupt you, man.
No, that just gets me going. That's a good point. And, a lot of people are not a lot, but I'm glad when I see people bring up the similar sentiment that like the language about or the commentary that defund and abolish are dangerous language and such, and that we would never succeed. They were saying the same thing about movements that preceded this, like the civil rights movement and gay marriage, a variety of things, and they did happen, which kind of leads me to the next tidbit from that amazing first response. Language is really important. And I tend to say reforms don't work, but I think better clarity, it's reformism, which you described really well. A reform that does chip away at the carceral state is successful in that it is leading toward abolition, which is, goes right along with the work that we're doing at 10 Demands, which is the road to abolition. So not everything achieves abolition right away. And also you mentioned that abolition is not, it's not an identity, and it's not an event. It's not a single thing that happens and it's over. It's a life. It's like a way of living, and it's ongoing. Reformism, obviously, on the other hand, as you mentioned, does exactly the opposite. It further ingrains us in the system itself. And, that's something that, Angela Davis has talked about. It's, and you yourself said it in your piece for Abolition for the People. Reform sustains existing social, economic, political, and/or legal systems, including but not limited to policing, two-party electoral politics, heteronormativity, criminal justice, and corporate destruction of the natural world. So I was wondering if you wanted to extrapolate further on this, maybe call out some reforms that Vicky Law and Maya Shenwar did a great job in their book, Prison by Any Other Name, in calling out some of these. But what are some that stand out to you as reforms that were heralded on both sides and actually just extended the carceral state or the surveillance state?
Oh shit, there's so much of that. There's such a long history of reforms that either, essentially accomplished nothing or were quickly absorbed into the statecraft of the prison industrial complex, such that the infrastructure of the prison industrial complex actually expanded, whether it was, diversity measures to try to diversify what at a certain point in history were essentially all white, cracker ass racist personnel throughout different carceral sites and jails, prisons, et cetera, all over. So now you diversify. Now that shit in many accounts is actually more violent because, for a bunch of different ethnographic reasons, right? Like you get people into these spaces that can wage intimate violence on the people that are incarcerated, right? Because they're from the same fucking neighborhoods, they're from the same places. And now they create beef because that's what the state does, right? The state organizes the beef. Instead, now one of you has legitimate violence on your side, and one of you is incarcerated and it's essentially property of the state. We could go down a whole archive of these. I mean, one of the reform measures that you brought back to me in getting me to talk about the late 90s into the 2000s was this reform bill in California that was seeking to essentially criminalize young people and incarcerate them as adults for being gang affiliated, et cetera. So children as young as 14. And so one of the points of division within the movement to stop that proposition was between a reformist crowd that wanted to kind of put up front and center the spectacle or maybe the specter of young people essentially being subjected to sexual violence in adult prisons, by the real criminals, so to speak, right? Right. That was the line. Like that was one of the ways that was kind of the criminalizing anti-Black scare tactic that a whole arm of people that saw themselves as progressives. I don't think they saw themselves as abolitionists, but they definitely saw themselves as progressives. They were pushing this line as the way to stop this proposition from criminalizing these children, right? And then there's a whole other side of us that identified as abolitionists said, we can't do this, right? This is against basic principles. You can't oppose criminalization and incarceration of children by authorizing and like not just legitimating, but like amplifying and exaggerating the already existing targeted criminalization, sexualization, gendered criminalization of in this case, it was cisgender Black and brown men in California prisons. So what you see is that even within the struggles against repressive measures, there's already a kind of reformist thinking that's more than ideological. It actually actively participates in policing and criminalizing people, their gender, their sex, their race, their bodies. And it's based on a certain kind of narrative, right? Because there are just as many accounts of people protecting each other from violence in these carceral sites. There's all kinds of stories of carceral organizing that folks have engaged in to stop sexual violence. That is, in many cases, literally organized by prison administration, meaning guards, and to some extent even wardens, right? There's a long history of that. So we have all kinds of examples of this. Now, let me be the first to say, I apologize to you that I haven't done this earlier, but let me take the opportunity to say, I formally want to come out and say, I fully endorse, I stand with you, or I stand as an ableist term. I exist with you in 10 Demands for Justice, the road to abolition. I fully support it. I'm gonna retweet it after this show is over. Thank you for doing it. This group of demands, the 8 to Abolition demands, there's like a small number of platforms that I feel are vital for people to see, vital to circulate, for a couple reasons. One is that they pose a stark juxtaposition to some of the platforms that have gained a lot of kind of corporate Hollywood social influencer type circulation, like 8 Can't Wait. 8 Can't Wait is garbage. We could spend a whole other show talking about why it's garbage. That's probably one of the best primary current examples of reformist measures that already contribute to both the logic of policing, criminalization, incarceration, and which also discipline movement imagination, so that the horizon of it becomes artificially, hamstrung, cut short, right? Like the imagination gets undermined, right? Whereas, if we look at 10 Demands for Justice, right? This is the one thing I want to say is the reason why I think it's important to endorse it is that certain types of reform measures are vital as rear guard actions to protect and sustain people, right? Sometimes they create some more room for us to continue to struggle. In other cases, they literally prevent people from dying, right? For example, getting services for people who are HIV positive in jail and in prison, right? That's a reform, right? For that matter, it's a modest reform, right? It's some shit that should already be there, right? So nobody is under any delusion that providing that is going to destroy the carceral apparatus, right? It's not, much less the kind of, queer-phobic carceral logic that structures. Nobody's under any delusion of that. At the same time, we will support that because we have so many of our people HIV positive who are dying and suffering in preventable ways, that we will back that, right? We will back that, and we'll attach to it a notion that they shouldn't be locked up anyways. All right. So there's that piece, but I also want to think specifically about 10 Demands for Justice, right? And the way I want to frame it is this: the reason I support it is because everything we're talking about here, it's about a condition of asymmetrical domestic war. It's it's not one directional because there's multiple populations that are targeted by it, but like, let's think about it as anti-Black domestic war and colonial domestic war, right? Simultaneously in complex ways, overlapping, sometimes in contradiction to each other, right? But it's an asymmetrical war. That's what the United States is. That's what civilization is, with a capital C, all right? If I take my own analysis seriously of civilization and the United States being a state of asymmetrical war among various fronts, then I look at something like 10 Demands for Justice, right? All right, so let me just run through a couple of them for the folks out here that have probably seen them, probably memorized them already. But defund the police, reallocate resources to impacted communities. Like, just think about this in the context of war. That's what I'm asking people to do, right? Think about these demands in the context of asymmetrical war. So you're defunding the police and you're redistributing. Okay, there's one. Demilitarize the police. Holy shit, right? If it's asymmetrical war, you're saying demilitarize the police. It's a reform now. But in the context of war, it means a certain thing, right? Institute complete law enforcement, transparency, and accountability. Now, this is stuff you hear people say all the time, but what they usually mean by its implementation still depends on the state. Now, y'all don't mean that. You're talking about, because the next demand is independently investigate police violence, police crimes, and abuses of power, right? Again, think about this in the context of war, right, of asymmetrical warfare, and strategic counter-protest violence, apologize and provide reparations, and carceral punishment. So it's to say that not only are there explicit demands in 10 Demands for Justice that already say abolition, right? Saying end carceral punishment That's an abolitionist statement, right? But all of the other things that could be grouped under demands that are conducive to certain types of reform are necessary kind of defensive guerrilla actions that seek to protect people from the targeted casualties that domestic war creates. I have to support that, right? I have to support that because they're also, the demands are under no delusion that this is kind of the goal, right? This is under a state of immediacy, under a state of acute vulnerability that is ongoing, that is not momentary, but is ongoing. So, and also, I appreciate the gesture of the fucking demand in the first place, right? Because the demand is not necessarily just a demand on the state or on your elected officials or on your whoever it is, your administrator is that you're. It's also a demand on your people, right? It's a demand that hopefully leads to some kind of principled, some growth in the principles of community that convene you, right? And that's the kind of the political, ideological, cultural, aesthetic work that demands sometimes also do, is it kind of calls people together. And I was going to just add this. I was going to say, as immediate defensive proposals to try to protect folks from the casualties of domestic war, I'm 100% with you, especially as pragmatic proposals. As a teacher, as an educator, as an activist, as an organizer, I always want to make additional world-making and life-enabling demands that don't necessarily fit within a platform, but which are kind of cultivated by platforms like 10 Demands for Justice. For example, and this is something I brought up in another organization, a coalition that I've been working with, around police killings, right? We've been dealing with police killings for a long time. We know who's targeted by them. We know that anti-Black police killing is a normalized part of how this state works ever since the foundations of policing. What is I think interesting and challenging is if we take a close look at the demands that emerge from local and national movements that seek to confront anti-Black police killings in particular, right? And the thing that you don't hear on a regular basis, don't read, hear, and feel on a regular basis is a certain demand, which I think is a demand in principle. What if the demand was no more police killings? Right? What if the demand, or maybe it's a principle too, right? What if the principle is we are here to organize to stop a single person from being killed by the cops? To me, again, that is a modest demand and it's a fairly common sense principle, but you don't get people in organizations saying that much, right? So I'm saying if we think about the immediate demands that are conducive to certain kinds of protective and self-defensive reform and tie them to these principles that say we are done with you, right? Our principle is to not have a single more of these moments of violence against any of our people. No more police sexual assaults, right? That's our goal. Our goal, we are organizing on the premise that we want zero cases of police sexual assaults on people. We want 0 cases of police killings of people. We want, in addition to no more carceral punishment, we want no more incarceration or jailing. And here's a modest one, because people are too poor to make bail, right? That's a movement that's kind of popping up around the United States too, right? But these are the kinds of demands that I think need to be layered behind, beneath, on top, and below the pragmatic demands that are coming out in agendas like 10 Demands for Justice. So that's what I'll say about that. I'm on board with it. Like I said, I appreciate you're doing it, and thank you. Yeah, there's a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said about demands.
Well, thank you. It's awesome to hear. We'll add you to the site.
Please do.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to pull a quote out from you. Actually, I can just take it from what you just said. Probably.
All right.
That don't make more work for you.
And I'm serious. I apologize for not doing it earlier, but I thought it would be like, I could at least do a grandstand on your show and say, hey, man, I'm here. I'm with you, blah, 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 right? Like I could do that thing.
Like, believe me, I'm going to use this video for multiple purposes now. I appreciate it, man. And, it's really interesting points you made toward the end there too. It got me think some of the things you said also got me thinking, like, we don't mention the sex registry, which is based
Mm.
on,
Mm.
you know, stranger danger BS, and
Yeah, man.
targets Black and brown people. We don't mention that in 35 states, it's legal for cops to have sex with people in their custody, which
Yep.
is clearly rape. There's so many different things, like we just couldn't even include it all.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then I think more importantly, you mentioned like kind of what is the underpinnings of all of these more pragmatic demands, which is like the cops need to stop raping people, like 0 times.
Zero.
You know, like
Stop.
until there are no cops, there needs to be no rapes and no
That's
killings.
well, but this is the point. This is the point, man. Is that this is what I'm convinced that if we organize around the principle of zero police killings, 0 police rape and sexual assault, then our folks will pretty quickly realize in order for that to happen, you actually need 0 cops.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me to like something I wanted to ask your, you know, for your thoughts on anyway, is all of the people who tell me, and I'm sure tell you, you know, we support what you're doing. You know, we agree that, you know, this is a problem, and we don't really understand what you mean by abolition, and we don't understand what you would put in place of cops, but like, we totally think they get too much money, but don't say defund, and certainly don't say abolish. And my response has always been like, okay, if I can get some big account on Twitter to retweet me if I don't put the hashtag abolish the police, maybe I'll do that. But I'm certainly not going to change my language when I'm the one being interviewed. I'm not going to remove references to what our end goals or our mindset is from the 10 Demands website and from our organizing. And but you talk about like, what if the point we're making, which this big account will certainly retweet for me, is no more police killings. We mean 0. And like, force the conversation.
Yeah.
But, you know, like, they're going to eventually get to the same point without us even having to say it.
This is part of what I think abolitionist praxis is, and people need to understand this, right? People act like abolition is some kind of sectarian line that you either, you know, you're either on this side or that side. That's not how this shit works. And I want to emphasize how important it is that there's a history of what from the outside looking in looks like failure, right? In abolitionist work, right? Like, there are those cynical people who would talk about Gabriel Prosser, Denmark VC, even Nat Turner as failed rebellions, right? Or failed plans of rebellion, which is fucking bullshit, right? That's not how this works, right? It's about building an archive of liberatory struggle, right? And sometimes they get you, right? But that's something you know going in, right? Like Denmark VC, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, you know, for that matter, Ida B. Wells, Assata Shakur, like all the folks, right? You know, Miss Major, like all these folks know, right? The long history of Black radical, Black feminist, Black queer and trans radical revolutionary struggle. Like, everybody knows going in, if they're serious, you know, when they're serious about it, like, they know that on the other end of this is that they are humble enough that there's no assumption they're going to see the other side, right? They're going to see the other side of the alleged, whatever you want to call a victory, right? So that's an important part of this, and which is also say that if you look at this long archive of abolitionist struggle, it's very much about creativity and experimentation in a collective sense, right? In a collective sense. And that's what I think is decentered and displaced and disciplined against by certain paradigms of social movement that have embedded themselves. I want to quote you, man. I wrote this down by hand because I was listening to your song, Throw Away the Key, because this just came up in my head as we're talking. This is your lyric. You said you got the rules for radicals. Editorial comment, Saul Alinsky's book, in case y'all don't know, right? Saul Alinsky wrote this book, Rules for Radicals, which I fucking hate, right? I think you should read it, but I think you should read it in a critical fashion. Okay, anyway, you got the rules for radicals, the activist handbook. I threw it all away. Let's create our own standard, right? We need to live by that set of lyrics, because part of what's happening, or what's been happening, and I'd say the last half century or so, is there's actually become a kind of paradigmatic way in which movements are supposed to think, organize, and teach things, right? And what you're talking about in the scenario where it's like, now you're in the position as an abolitionist, as somebody who wants transformative, revolutionary, et cetera, change, You want a new world, a new society in which people thrive and live and be, you know what I mean? You're having to compromise with these fuckers all the time. All the time. And it's because they're scared of a word, man. Like, and they're scared of a concept. And you know what? In a way, they actually should be, because it poses a direct and creatively destructive challenge to their entire way of being in this shit, right? Oh, by the way, shout out to Erica Miners. I don't know if you've had Erica Miners on your podcast yet. Erica Miners is somebody, a colleague and friend and comrade of mine, teaches at Northeastern Illinois University, but is an abolitionist, has been abolitionist, human for as long as I've known her, and her work around sex offender, sex registry, stranger danger, like is fucking indispensable. And she's great. So Erica Miners, shout out, you heard it. But this is what we're getting at, right? Is that abolition is also it's a guerrilla war. All right. So like the scenario you're talking about, we have to calibrate that all the time. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, and you make certain kinds of compromise, and then you might regret it later. So go ahead and fucking fail. You know what I mean? Like, go ahead and fail, but fail in a blaze of glory, my friend. Right? Like, I remember being on more than one show, or not, well, show in terms of a public broadcast show, and then more than one panel where I realized that I was there with somebody who was a fucking pig. So I shouldn't say that, because I pigs are cool animals. Who was a fucking reactionary, who was basically like a cop in their politics in their head. And I realized, like, oh, okay, it's actually fucked up for me to think about them and what they're saying as being in some kind of realm of rational discourse and debate. I actually need to just yell at this person, cuss them out, and call them what they are, right? And that's my role, man. Like, not everybody's gonna, feel comfortable doing that. And I'm like, I'm already tagged a certain way anyway. So it's like, I'm cool with being that person. I'm just gonna try to like run you out the room and just yell at you and just call you what you are, because, maybe that actually galvanized a lot of people in the room who are feeling that way, and who are feeling completely delegitimated and frankly demoralized by the fact that this person's being given a platform, right? So maybe at that point, my role is to say, no, you're a piece of shit. Like, you actually don't mean all this little stuff that you do about, you care about. It's like, no, you're actually a piece of shit. You are for the police state. We're just on opposite sides of this war. So let's be really clear about that. Sometimes you have to name that too, right? So at the same time that we got to play at a certain point, somebody you realize somebody is not going to be your friend. In fact, they're your enemy. And I think there's something valuable to be said in naming that. And I'm saying that to a group of people I'm working with now around the so-called critical race theory attacks that are happening all around the country, from K through 12 to university. Like, part of what I'm saying is that we need to actually stop trying to defend critical race theory, because these people don't care about critical race theory. They just care about like anything that is not white nationalist pedagogy and curriculum being part. So I'm like, we need to just counterattack them and call them what they are, right? And they call them, this is a white supremacist, white nationalist movement. And there's some tension around that, because folks are like, oh, white supremacy means the Klan and it means the Pride, the Proud Boys. And it's like, no, man, like, this is exactly what it is. Right? Respectability, this kind of curricular respectability and defending the children, that is a white supremacist line. It's as old as white supremacy is old. So I think we play, and then at other times we have to be unapologetic, and not only that, we have to be joyful in making the counterattacks, man. Like, I don't know, that's just me.
It's my nature too, and I'm having this philosophical like conundrum. I grew up. My cousins co-founded Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice, and they're called the Sharps. And
they don't fuck around.
No. And I grew up, I'm younger than them, and I grew up modeling my mindset and behavior from them. I looked up to them. And so my high school years, I was a straight A student and almost didn't graduate. I was almost incarcerated because I walked around beating up any Nazi or white supremacist or, Confederate flag, I'm going to punch you in the face. Like,
I need to hang out with you more, man. Shit. I'm all talk. Like, you're the real deal. I need to hang out with you more.
I was.
Shit.
But here's my dilemma, man. Like, that is who I was. And my mom clearly didn't like the phone calls from police and was worried about me. And she was a pacifist and she was an activist herself, but she was from the hippie generation, and she was not in the the radical like SDS. Like, she was more peaceful, anti-nuclear war, and so she's the person who really got me to look at other ways of making positive change that wasn't directly violent against individuals.
Right.
which I appreciate. I think direct violence against individuals is not the best approach. I'm not totally against it, but I don't think that is the solution unto itself. So the years go by, I'm doing more and more activist work. I'm now like 20 plus years into this, and I remain an anti-fascist, and I'm an abolitionist, and I don't think you can really be an abolitionist without being an anti-fascist.
I agree.
I think that's
really, why isn't everybody a fucking anti-fascist, man?
But see, here's the like intricacy of all of this. Anti-fascists as a movement, and like not Antifa as this thing, but anti-fascists collectively, they do this work where one of their primary missions is to identify and destroy Nazis. And they're not doing it with violence on a one-on-one basis the way I did as a kid. They are like doing intense amounts of research and IDing them, finding where they work, notifying their family members and employees, getting them fired, things like that. And they have a really clear line as you cannot work with someone who believes X, Y, or Z. And to the point of reaching out to me and in a couple occasions now actually saying, I can't trust you as an anti-fascist anymore because you work with so-and-so. And my line has been that as an abolitionist, I believe that even someone who is on the far right, who's been fed generations of disinformation, who like the Germans before World War II that almost killed off my entire people, were convinced into believing that Jews were to blame. These people, for example, in the Deep South or wherever, were taught to believe that Black people and Jews are the reason for their poverty. I believe that as an abolitionist that they can be transformed, that they can unlearn all of this propaganda and disinformation. And so I will not organize with a Proud Boy. I will not, I will not platform a Proud Boy or a Boogaloo Boy or whatever on my show. But if there's evidence that this person, a former Proud Boy, and again, I've had a couple of them reach out to me and thank me for this. If they have proven that they have left the group, changed their thinking, and can now be trusted, they've passed that like info, OPSEC, the security, whatever, then I absolutely will organize them and I will embrace them. That to me has been where I've like positioned myself in, recent times. And then I hear you say, and I admire you, I look up to you. And I hear you say, sometimes you just got to tell this white supremacist motherfucker that they're on the wrong side. They're the enemy. How do I commingle that?
Well, sometimes people don't want to be your enemy and they don't realize they're your enemy until you tell them.
Okay.
Right? Like, it happens all the time, right? It usually happens with liberals.
Right.
All right. It usually happens with liberals, white liberals. Now we're very much in a multiculturalist era, liberalism post-Obama, especially. And sometimes that's where that shit seems to be most pedagogically and politically impactful, is where you say, look, motherfucker, you've been assuming that we're friends, right? You've been working in a way where you presume you're doing things in the interest, or at least in some kind of symbiosis with what I think I represent, and you're wrong, right? And here's why you're wrong. It's because X, Y, and Z were on opposite sides on this. So that's where it is, right? And I leave it with you now, right? I leave it with you now. You're a grown-ass person. I leave it with you now, right? So there's that piece of it. On the other side of this, I want to say to you, we have to, I think, be dynamic and principled about the different roles we can inhabit in this ongoing struggle to transform, abolish, and really like completely overturn the society that we're in, right? That means a lot of fucking messiness. And we're not always gonna agree with each other. Shit, we might not even like each other sometimes, right? And I don't want to try to resolve that. I really don't. Like, I'm not interested in that. I don't think we all have to get along or agree with each other necessarily, right? As long as we understand with some humility, we understand what roles we can inhabit and what mission we can embrace in this kind of like messy, ongoing abolitionist struggle. And also to try to remain in some form of conversation, if not community, conversation with those who would challenge us, right? I think that is constantly important. It's uncomfortable. It like makes you mad because people are calling you, you know what I mean? They're calling you an asshole and they're saying you're full of shit. I don't trust you. But so you got to like be able to kind of handle that. I'm not saying engage with it, but just handle it. I was saying this the other day to somebody else, is like, I think we need to have, this is what having a kind of historical sensibility says. We gotta do collective study a lot. So I would say part of it is that, right? Like if we can be in some form of collective study with each other, including and especially with people who we don't necessarily think we ideologically agree with on everything, but we might share certain principles in common, even though we might have vehement disagreements about how we like act on those principles and how we teach and work and organize around those principles. So I'm not saying just do collective study with anybody, right? I'm saying do it with people that you think you might have some basic shared principles with. If you both call yourselves abolitionists and you're serious about it, that's a pretty good shared principle to work around, right? Those forms of collective study, I think, are really critical because they tend to provide everybody with like a long historical sensibility, which is, again, I come back to this term, it's very deeply humbling, right? Because now what you can see is that your political ideological beef with another person or organization is actually not fucking unique, and it's not new. It's not about you, right? So stop making it about you, right? This is like about this whole historical messiness that has constituted the movements that are trying to liberate, Black folks from chattel logics, right? And indigenous people from colonialism, et cetera, right? That's part of all this shit. Sometimes we're at war with each other over this, right? Sometimes we beef with each other. I mean, shit, like look what happened, at UCLA with Malana Karenga's organization and the Panthers. I mean, that shit marks LA and Southern California Black politics to this day, right? And of course, the state and counterintelligence program and FBI and LAPD exploited that shit, right? So that's why I emphasize collective study all the time, because here's the thing, man, is like, the repressive counterinsurgency of the state is studying us by the microsecond. All right. Like they are engaged in institutionalized, infrastructures of analytical, critical study of these movements that we are variously part of every microsecond of every day. Right. When that general was in front of Congress, a couple of weeks ago, talking about critical race theory, and he was like, I read critical race theory, just like I read Maoism, I read Marxism. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but that should scare the shit out of everybody watching this podcast, right? But it shouldn't scare you because he said that, because they've been doing that. It should scare us because we don't think about it that way, right? I don't think we fully appreciate just how serious and rigorous the side of repression, the side of reproducing the society as it is. Their studies of the insurgency, of the revolt, of the abolitionist struggle, of liberation struggle, of sovereignty struggle, et cetera, is rigorous, it is deep, it is serious. There's a whole field in academia called area studies that comes straight from the CIA. That's what it is. That's what area studies is, right? My significant other comes out of a kind of radical arm of Asian studies, which emerges in like radical feminist anti-imperialist response to the originary versions of Asian studies, which was about empire. It was about kind of emergent neoliberalism, Cold War shit, and empire. So when you like map out that picture, it's about those two things. One is like you can play that role. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think I'm fit to play that role, just like I'm not fit to play a lot of other roles, right? But you might be able to play that role of engaging with some of these people who are in this messy place where they've begun to disidentify with a kind of white reactionary element. And here's the thing, man, it's like those people can be weaponized and politicized against the reactionary element in some really profound and effective ways, right? And it's not to draw out false equivalences, but I will say that there's something about, in the context of war, there's something about folks who defect. Okay, and like earlier, I talked about Geronimo Gijaga, right? Geronimo essentially defected, right? Here's somebody who won medals in the Vietnam War, right? Who was like proud of his ability to like wage imperial war for the United States. And he realized like, oh, fuck, this is, I've been utilizing my skills. I've been developing these skills for the wrong side. And then he becomes this indispensable part of the Black Panther Party, informed the Black Liberation Army, becomes a political prisoner because of that, right? Like he actually weaponized himself, politicized himself against the very state that he had waged war for. So I'm saying, let's appreciate that background, right? And then let's think about what it might mean to turn people against some of these reactionary elements that maybe they're ready to defect from, but they just need somebody to mentor and guide them through that, right? Now that's some careful shit, man. Like that shit is dangerous. So right, so it's like if I'm Antifa, if I'm part of the organized work of Antifa, by necessity, structurally, I might have to not fuck with you, right? Because you might be a vulnerability. But that's, look, man, like cool. Like I'm over here doing this thing, you do that shit, but I can't fuck with you because that shit is dangerous. That, look, man, I keep coming back to this, right? This is what it means to be engaged in multi-fronted struggle. Let's just try to do collective study together and actually, hash it out and debate with each other and say to each other explicitly, like, okay, as a matter of principle, I can't fuck with you, right? Good luck doing that shit. I can't relate to you. I can't do it. But if you can fucking pull that off, do it. If you decide that shit is wrong, like I'm open to, that's the grace that I wanted to really emphasize. There has to be some grace to this, which is say like, am I allowed to admit that I fucked up, right? Like, can I say that I did all this shit and I'm not good at it? Are y'all cool with me coming back and trying to do this shit with you? Like that's where I think there's a missing element, because if you look at like the liberal mushy, whatever, element, reformist element, all the way to the far right, there's an interesting way in which they are very graceful with each other. Donald Trump accepted, right? They're very graceful with each other in the most fucked up colonial and anti-Black ways, right? Like they can fuck each other up like in the worst betraying ways. And like, because they know they have certain kinds of shared repressive and oppressive principles, they're like, ah, shit, come on back. We got you.
And they
do that shit all the time.
Yeah, and they privilege from the same stuff. That's what they want to maintain. And for clarity, I'm not going to take on the role of transforming these people, but I will say that what tends to work is those who've already done it themselves go back and try to pull others out.
I feel you. Yeah.
Which is, I've never been on that side, so I don't know how to do that.
But I'm saying even that is some shit, man. Like that's some shit. Like that's
the one thing that we my parents were working class leftists. Like I was never even considered, and a Jew who experienced anti-Semitism. Like there's no way I was being on the far right ever. But the one thing that I today have in common with people who protested on January 6th is a distrust of the state and a wanting for people power. The striking, terrifying, disgusting difference is the intense racism and homophobia and all of the other stuff that goes along with the other side.
Yeah.
But for those who are just like, I'm poor as shit, no one gives a shit about me, like I don't know what to do, everyone in my community is a racist, I'm going to be a racist. Those people who don't actually understand why they're on the side they are, but know that the state is the enemy, they're convertible.
Yeah. And this is what it means to be living in a fascist moment, right? I mean, this is just both the danger and the profound responsibility, political responsibility of living in a certain type of fascist moment, because we're in a moment certainly of insurgency and revolt. We're also in a moment of reaction and fascist, all kinds of fascist logics, tendencies, and streams of like community that are happening, like in so many different venues.
Yeah, it's a scary time.
But this is what domestic war looks like. You know what I mean? Like we're just in a moment where it's clearer. Right, it's a certain clarifying moment. Like we were just as much in a domestic war moment when fucking November 2008 happened and Obama was. I was like, okay, this is a new phase in how domestic war is going to be waged, right? And then 2 terms later, you see what is here now, right? And so that's what I'm saying about how a kind of need for dynamic collective analysis and study, but grounded always in principle. It can't just be this kind of mushy thing where anything goes. It's like, no, it has to be grounded in a collective principle, collective sense of responsibility and commitment. And that's how I see what abolition is, right? And it's got to be grounded. And also we got to call out when people are fake ass, identifying themselves as abolitionists, because there's an opportunity in it. You know what I mean? Like I see Van Jones doing this abolition, in some weird ways, they'll call himself abolitionist. Like that guy is so far, he's a liberal pundit, and now he's the recipient of Jeff Bezos' $100 million courage and civility grant, which really means, I think I was saying, I think about it's like, this is about domestication, right? It's a $100 million domestication grant, right?
And you in that article about reformism for abolition for the people actually talked about liberal philanthropy, and I just did a whole article through Twitter, Twitter,
I saw it.
Twitter thread or whatever about that, and then I wrote when I heard about this, you don't believe me yet, with the example I gave about Buffett's son in Kingston, New York, and how he abandoned Black women and his, the organization's priorities to come to Kingston and create his utopia. Wait a few years and tell me what happens with this Jeff Bezos, Van Jones investment. Because it's certainly not going to be dismantling of anything. And
and like this brings a whole dimension out that I think I want to emphasize if people are with us in this conversation here, which is that, okay, so there's a certain way in which it's really clear that what reformism wants to do is to perpetuate existing, foundational systems, racial capitalism, right, heteronormativity, patriarchy, colonial imperial order. I think that it doesn't take much for people to get their heads around that. That's what a reform is, right? It's like to change these existing systems of power, systems of production, systems of hierarchy in order to sustain and perpetuate, to keep them from falling apart or being exploded by people who are in rebellion against them, right? So people rebel against them and then you concede shit. And then the university is a great example. I work at probably the most life-destroying, violent public institution, public educational, so-called schooling educational institution on the planet. University of California is responsible probably for more imperial and colonial and anti-Black damage than almost any other, maybe other than it's a public institution. So it's deep, right? The bounce is deep. And I see it all the time with the university, is that it is so willing to engage in reformist performances and reformist kind of tepid triage type reformist measures that do something that I wanted to emphasize, and that is to re-legitimate the system. It's not just to perpetuate it. It's about winning legitimacy. That's why we're in a moment now of counterinsurgency, in which the leading arm of counterinsurgency is not necessarily violent repression, although that is always there, right? It's arguably the leading arm of it right now, as we talk in late July 2021, is reformism. That reformism is this broad spectrum of movements, organizations, people, proposals, measures, and platforms that are scrambling to reproduce the legitimacy of, in most cases, what they're talking about is policing. Right? How do we rescue the legitimacy of policing from the jaws of Black revolt, of abolitionist challenge, and also of models of community safety that are actually winning people, right? How do we rescue, how do we reinvigorate and re-legitimate policing as an apparatus, as a form of power? That's what reformism does. It is about trying to win legitimacy, and to win, in that sense, it's part of the counterinsurgent, repression of liberation struggle, right? It's you want to win hearts and minds back over to that apparatus.
And meanwhile, results just came out of a pilot program in New York City where trained mental health professionals are responding to 911 calls. And not only have there been fewer deaths and hospitalizations, but more people are getting help. More people are asking for help. It's working, and it works. And versions of this that may or may not have problems, but the Cahoots program in Oregon, there's evidence of it working. And yet, we're in the context of, Joe Biden, as you said, legitimizing the system by saying he wants to end private prisons, which would just transfer all of those incarcerated people to public prisons, which also have a profit stream for corporations. has also requested that the Department of Justice and Homeland Security give cops $4 billion in new subsidies.
There it is.
And
There it
even
is.
beyond that, he wants to give $350 billion in COVID relief to cops. And then we have the George Floyd Act, which gives $750 million more. I'm sorry, I think it was 350 million in COVID relief, but 750 million more in the George Floyd Act. Nobody except me, it seems like, is talking about the Breathe Act. Not a single politician.
Oh God, yeah. No, this is truth. This is truth. And here, let me add to the problem here. What makes it possible for those things to float the way they do is that there are so many coalitions, organizations, nonprofit groups, et cetera, that identify themselves as at least abolition friendly, if not abolitionist, right? Like they're abolition friendly, but they are fully behind these measures, right? Measures that directly expand the infrastructure of police and policing, right? But the reformist article of faith is that by doing so, it will somehow improve that institution in such a way where it is less anti-Black, less deadly, and less violent, right? And there's not a shred, all the evidence that's available points otherwise, right? That the more you expand policing, the more police violence there is, and the more asymmetrical it is in terms of being anti-Black and colonial. Like there's nothing to disprove this. You can get as many LGBTQ people, women, Black folks, indigenous people, whatever, right? You can get as many people into the police force as you want. And it is entirely likely that these forms of asymmetrical and targeted violence will probably at least sustain, if not get worse. LAPD is a good example of this. You see it all over the United States, all over the kind of the modern Western world. Like this is what they do. And then on the other hand, just to kind of amplify your example of what's happening with mental health professionals, I would just add a couple of things to that. One is that we still need to decarcerate mental health provision, right? Like there's a way that still kind of stays within a carceral paradigm. And they're not even 1 degree separated from the cops, right? So like that's an improvement. Let's keep pushing that logic a little bit, right? Let's say, okay, if the cops are not involved, right? And then we have mental health professionals involved, but they're still connected to the cops. Do we even need that, right? And then there's other examples. I'm going to prop up 2 examples right now that I think represent a workable model for communities all over the place, right? And one is Ujima Medics, based in Chicago, co-founded by Amika Tendahi, Martine Cavarro, and they formed in response to the fact that, as Flavor Flav once said, right, 911's a joke in Chicago for Black folks, and they're founded on the basic practice of providing 2 things. One was emergency asthma care, and the other one was emergency gunshot wound care. Because what Martine and Amika saw was all these preventable deaths among people in Southside and Black Chicago on the street because 911 response was so slow and to some cases non-existent. So they found Ujima Medics. They draw from like a long tradition of Black women's healing. They take community response. They train everybody from like 7-year-olds to 97-year-olds, I think, right? Like everybody. They go to elementary schools, community for. They train everybody in these basic practices of care: gunshot wound care, asthma care. Saved I don't know how many people's lives. You can go to their website. Like I contribute money to them all the time. I try to get them involved in. I try to get involved in anything they're doing, and vice versa. Excellent example of what happens, right? And like what they've done is they've demonstrated that as Amika put it to me more than once, right? She said, if you were Black and you live in Chicago, the state is not coming to help you, right? You just know that. So we realize we need to take collective responsibility for the community, for our community, and defend ourselves, and also nourish and protect ourselves. That shit works, man. Like it fucking works. Another example I'll give, which is local to me here. By the way, I forgot to say, I live in occupied Kauai and Tonga territory, Southern California. You said I work at UC Riverside. I just want to honor the fact that my place of work is just down the street from where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of Taisha Miller in 1998. So I say that every time I'm in any kind of public forum. There's something called CAT 911, community action teams, which are starting to spread throughout Southern California. I work with, I want to be more directly involved with it, but I'm with people who are directly involved, and whole community people directly involved with it. They're dealing with COVID-19 stuff. They're doing mutual aid. They're dealing with domestic violence, sexual violence, mental health stuff, wound care, transformative justice practices. And it's the same kind of thing. It's trying to address the fact that there are entire communities of people throughout you know, everywhere really, but throughout Southern California, that either don't trust calling 911 or can't call 911 because they're undocumented, because they're on probation, they're on parole. They know that if they call because of this particular situation, that the person that is doing the harm is going to go back to jail and prison. They don't necessarily want that, right? They want the situation dealt with. They want reparation. They want healing, but they don't want incarceration. So I'm saying there are like all these examples popping up all over the place of effective ways to actually build and improve your community, to address violence in your community, to address exploitation and vulnerability in your community, that completely obsolete police power, right? And in fact, are against it, right? They actively undermine police power. People are like, oh shit, we actually don't need you fuckers. Like, get out. We don't need you here. Like, we can do stuff for ourselves. Like, we can take care of this. Like, in fact, maybe if you stop criminalizing us, we wouldn't have these problems in the first place. So I think, I mean, this is abolitionist praxis.
Yeah.
This is what it looks like. Right. And by the way, sometimes it fucking fails.
So
right?
On that note, you know, there is definitely a direct connection between abolition and this transformative justice and protecting ourselves, you know, providing our own systems to to keep us safe and treat in emergencies and mutual aid. So one of the things I've been working on is, or kind of starting to work on, is helping Mutual Aid Hub, which is the work of Ground Game LA, actually. It's like under their umbrella to expand and kind of fine tune itself so that autonomous mutual aid groups across the country can share resources and ideas, best practices and things like that. And I think, you know, that's the kind of thing that would be very helpful if they can all rely on each other without having some top-down authority demand, you know, placing demands on autonomous groups. That's like the one thing that, like, for an entire culture of people who have so firmly ingrained in themselves that the only ways for things to happen in our society is either through the government or through a corporation. Looking at these examples you gave is empowering and inspiring, but then there's this like part in the back of your head, like, well, like, you know, we need to do this everywhere. How do we do this everywhere? Because if we don't do it everywhere, we're not going to get rid of cops. Like, it seems so, again, like, we as abolitionists require this imagination and creativity, and that's hard for people in this capitalist society. So my final questions for you are: one, thoughts on a similar national infrastructure of these type of things so that they can share best practices, and say someone in you know, a small town in Maine learns from what they're doing in LA or in Oregon or in Chicago or wherever, and can implement it there. Secondly, for those who you know, for those who want to get involved, you know, beyond just learning about abolition, people who want to make change in their communities, what do you recommend people do?
This is such a good question. I'm so happy that we're going to finish with this one. And I have some concrete examples and resources that I think people can draw from. One thing I'll say is this: you brought up mutual aid. That's something I've been educated in really intensely over the last, since the pandemic started, right? Is a certain type of, you know, queer and radical and abolitionist mutual aid tradition, which is really, it's really another way of thinking and doing deep solidarity, right? And like Dean Spade's resources on this are so indispensable because of how he clarifies what mutual aid is as opposed to charity and philanthropy. It's like a distinction that is worth repeating every day, right? Like every day we wake up, we should say mutual aid is this, charity is over there, right? Like every day. I mean, I say that only because, like, I accept the fact that I'm like involuntarily born and raised in a culture which is all about fucking charity and philanthropy all the time, right? That's what Jeff Bezos is reinforcing with this performance of his after he comes back from outer space. I wish that fucker had stayed there. I wish his rocket had fucking exploded. Fuck that guy.
Oh man.
Sorry. Fuck Ben Jones too. Anyway, I just gotta express that. So mutual aid, solidarity, like as part of abolitionist struggle. I want to say this about mutual aid, right? Is like, and this is something Dean Spades taught me about a year ago, actually, is that, there's a tendency to want to do a couple of things. One is to reduce mutual aid to charity. Let's not do that. Let's understand what mutual aid is. It's deep solidarity. So on the one hand, I'll say this to anybody that hears this that isn't already connected to a community or a collective of folks that's doing work but wants to be. Mutual aid is probably near you. There's probably some form of mutual aid organization or practice that is near you that you can join. That is one of the, I think, easiest ways for anybody who catches this conversation to get directly involved with some kind of collective that may be conducive to doing the kind of world transforming work that you and I are obsessively talking about today, right? Mutual aid is an excellent avenue into that. I don't care if it's with a religious institution. I don't care if it's with something, it could be anything. It could be an informal collective of people that are just trying to like help out unhoused people, make sure people are taken care of when they're sick. I mean, I don't care what, I'm not necessarily talking about a formal mutual aid organization. I'm talking about mutual aid practices are undoubtedly near you. Why? Because in my view, it's part of a kind of insurgent human condition that has to be present because of the oppressive nature of the civilization we live in. It's like people have to engage in forms of mutual aid all the fucking time, right? So I'd say that's one immediate way that you can get involved with the mutual aid organization or practice that is near you, that is with you. Just do that now. You might already be doing that and just not recognize it as such. That's what folks taught me. Is like, shit, I've actually been doing something called mutual aid for years. I just didn't understand it that way, but now I do, and that's meaningful. That's number one. Number two is, you talked about like building a national infrastructure that can like get people connecting what they're doing in like Topeka to what they're doing in Austin to what they're doing in like Long Island to what they're doing in whatever Oakland, right? This is also something that I learned from a variety of people over the last year. I don't know that I would advocate for something that I would call a national infrastructure, right? What I think I would advocate for, and this goes along the lines of what I've been saying at different points in our conversation, I would advocate for a guerrilla model of proliferation, right? That what I think we need to provide for each other are tools, resources, and thought that model how to do various forms of abolitionist organizing and community building, regardless of where you are, whether you're incarcerated, you know what I mean? Like whether you're unhoused and on the street, whether you're in, the farmlands of the Midwest, wherever you might be, we have to proliferate these models in such a way that people can take them and just multiply. The nice thing is that in this day and age, we don't have to just say proliferate. We can also say, let's proliferate, but let's also convene. That's the one thing I would add, right? It's not just proliferation for the sake of it. It's also let's find ways to convene with each other to share this shit out. And like you and I doing it today, right? We haven't talked before until this morning, right? Morning for me, afternoon for you, right? Well, we haven't talked till today. So this is a very small scale, I think demonstration of how convening can work. Like I learned a fucking shitload from you today, right? For real, like just in terms of you talking through the dilemmas and the challenges that you're facing. Like it's going to take me a while to process all that. But this is what I'm talking about, proliferation while we also convene. We can convene all the time. Like put my contact info out at the bottom of like your post when you put this up, because like hey, hit me up. Like if I can be in any way useful to a conversation that y'all are having wherever you are, right? If I can share my failures with you, if I can share my lessons with you, if you can share any of that with you, right? That will participate. Please reach out, man. Like I don't charge for that shit either, by the way. I'm not a fucking professional consultant, right? Anytime I get an honorarium, like I usually give a big chunk of it to an organization that I work with out here, a couple organizations I work with out here. So it's not about that. I'm saying hit me up if I can participate in the proliferation. If I can participate for that matter in the convening, it's proliferation while we also convene and share. Another example I'll give you is one that I've been working with over the last year, which is the Cops Off Campus campaign and coalition, right? It started with a bunch of colleagues in the University of California across, the 11 campuses and whatnot. And what I saw that gives me a lot of radical abolitionist, I think, vision and optimism about this model of proliferation and convening is that the Cops Off Campus Coalition started with just a couple dozen people from across the University of California system. Within 8-9 months, if you go to their Cops Off Campus Coalition website, it was all over this continent, right? From like junior colleges to Ivy League college, in terms of the traditional hierarchy of institutions, across the entire hierarchy of higher education institutions, there was a proliferation of chapters of people that were moving to get police off their campus, right? And again, we saw that not as necessarily even the end goal, right? This was almost like a tactic to exhibit to folks, to show folks how you can have these institutions implementing completely different models of infrastructure that do not any longer tolerate, or even require, much less tolerate, a police presence. It proliferated quickly, and the thing was that we would also convene, right? The coalition would get together every so often. People would share out what they were doing. There's a kind of constant discussion of principles, debates over tactics and strategies. This is the work. This is what it looks like. So we don't have to replicate the paradigms of monopoly capitalism where there's one organization, where there's one organization that we all are, pay a membership fee to. No. We proliferate, but we also do it in conversation with each other all the time. That's what this looks like. That's how we stop the other side from absorbing us in the reformist way, and also from destroying us in the kind of in the counterintelligence way, right? In the counter-insurgency way. That's how we do it. And that's also how we fucking protect each other.
Love it, man. Thank you so much.
It's an honor to be here, man. This was fucking great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it means a lot. You said you learned from me. I've learned a ton from you. You quoted one of my songs. You endorsed 10 Demands. You made my day, and I'm turning 40 very soon, as you know.
Happy birthday in advance, man.
A good birthday present. I really appreciate you. I will let others know that you will make yourself available. They should certainly take you up on it. I hope they don't bother you too much. And
I'm good, man. At Dylan Rodriguez. That's my Twitter.
Okay. And, I think, I'm glad. To me, that is what Mutual Aid Hub is about. It's providing a single place online where people can find their mutual aid group locally. But other than that, all they're doing is convening. They're having these meetings where anyone can come and learn and share information. I'm glad to hear that's happening in other spaces too. And I just want to offer to you, if you ever want to gopher, or just another person in any of these abolitionist conversations, I'm always available as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you, man. Thank you. I'm calling you.
Yeah, I would love to represent 10 Demands, and just help in any way that I can.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'm calling you for that for sure. Now we're bonded now, man. It's too late.
Oh yeah. All right, brother. One love. Thank you.
Take care of yourself. Take care of everyone. All right. I love you all. I'll talk to you soon, huh?
Peace.
All right, man. Peace.